So today we'll be discussing research methods and how it relates to the field of sociology. I'm guessing at some point throughout our academic careers, most likely in high school and maybe some college courses, we've conducted some type of research. And that research may have been scientific in nature or may have been what we call basic research. And we'll discuss basic research a little later on as to what that qualifies as. But as we go through this, I want you to be able to make the distinction between quantitative and qualitative research. So when we use the term quantitative research, we're talking about essentially our ability to quantify a problem by generating data that can be used statistically. So what does that mean? Well, we're looking to quantify people's attitudes, people's opinions, people's behaviors, or different variables that may come into existence. And I want you to think about quantitative research from the perspective of polls or surveys. For those of us who use Facebook, you may have a friend who creates a post on Facebook and says, hey, what hair color should I dye my hair today? And you'll see these different polls. On Twitter, you'll see polls particularly related to politics. Do you support the president's decision? Do you support, the financial subsidies provided by Congress? Yes or no? Those can be scientific in nature to a certain extent, and we'll talk about some of the obstacles that type of data will face later on. Or online surveys. Some of us may go to fast food restaurants, for example. And when you go through the Burger King line or you go through the McDonald's line, what you'll notice on your receipt is that it states, if you call this number and answer this short survey, you'll be rewarded with a free Big Mac or whatever it may be. So those are forms of quantitative research. This idea that we can begin to measure people's responses based on the number of occurrences that exist. So let me explain what that means. If I give you a yes or no survey question, if I give you a Likert scale survey question, which essentially means strongly agree to I don't know, to disagree, to strongly disagree. That's a Likert scale. I'm trying to gauge your feelings in relation to answering this particular question at hand. Well, I'm limiting your responses and I'm measuring how many times did someone say they strongly agree with this statement or this question. How many times did people answer yes? How many times did people answer no? And then I break that down into statistical form. 50% of the students said that parking is an issue at Rio Hondo College. 75% of the students felt that textbooks were way too expensive at Los Angeles Harbor College. And so you want to take that into consideration when we're doing quantitative research. This idea that we're seeking to break information into statistical form by limiting the options that people have to choose. Now, when we talk about quantitative research, because we're distributing surveys, because we're conducting polls, we can reach the masses relatively easily. We can post a survey online, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. We can gather people's email addresses and send a massive email blast asking, can you please participate in the survey? So our sample size is typically very large and allows us to gather a tremendous amount of information, look at the frequency in the occurrence in particular responses, and then be able to disseminate, be able to share that information rather easily with the communities that need access to it. When we talk about quantitative research, right, and we look at it from the perspective of a social statistic, right, Once again, let's look at this. During the 2018 to 2019 academic year, 85% of students enrolled on a full-time basis at Rio Hondo College believed textbooks were not affordable. Well, that tells us volumes of information. It tells us that students have an issue with the affordability of textbooks. That is the type of information that I can communicate easily to the administration of Rio Hondo College and say, look, we have an issue. We need to offer book vouchers. We need to work with these book manufacturers or publishers and let them know your textbooks are way too expensive for our students. And so I want you to think about quantitative research as we go through this, and then begin to focus on what we call qualitative research. And qualitative research is primarily exploratory research. And so what do we mean by exploratory research? Well, we seek to gain an understanding of people's reasons or opinions or motivations for thinking a particular way, not by limiting their choices to strongly agree to all the way to strongly disagree or a yes or no response. Instead, we want to dig deeper. We want to give individuals what we call open-ended questions. So we're going to pose a question to an individual, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, and hope that they provide us with a very detailed response, because we want to be able to gauge their perceptions, their feelings about a particular topic, rather than just saying, hey, yes or no. Yes or no doesn't provide a complete response. Yes or no responses work well when we're asking about the cost of textbooks, but it doesn't necessarily work well when we're asking about what has your experience been like at Los Angeles Harbor College? What has your experience been like at Rio Hondo College? Because qualitative research typically requires some type of immediate face-to-face interaction. We can argue that in qualitative research, the sample size has to be rather small. Because if the sample size is too large, it's going to be very difficult to collect the detailed information that you're seeking. Now, qualitative research, in other words, provides us with the complete picture. But you only get the complete picture, and we'll discuss this a little later, if you ask the right questions. And those right questions have to be asked in focus groups, in interviews, and at times we can conduct observations of individuals, right? Observing their behaviors without disrupting their natural behaviors. We have to go into observations, and we'll talk about this again later on, knowing exactly what we're looking to gather, the information that we're looking to gather. Now, when we start to look at qualitative research, we can look at our in-depth interviews and the transcript of those in-depth interviews. We analyze it. We analyze the data, the information that's gathered. We look at historical books, letters, and diaries. What was this person experiencing at this point in history or at this point in their life experiences? We may analyze text messages or social media or networking. I want you to think about this. Our president, Donald Trump, his tweets will be analyzed, in my opinion, forever. His tweets and the ill-conceived nature of his tweets, or the reckless nature of his tweets, will be used in leadership books as to what not to do as a leader for many, many years to come. That level of analysis of those tweets falls into the category of qualitative research. So I want you to think about that. So what happens is that after we conduct our interviews, after we do observations, if we do focus groups, if we're analyzing text or tweets or whatever it may be, we start to now try to identify patterns in the collected behavior. And we engage in what we call interpretive analysis. And this allows us, once again, to relate it to a particular research question, right? To answer any major questions or topics that we're seeking to answer, that we're seeking to address. Now, we're going to skip the scientific approach right now, and we'll discuss this in future classes. But let's start looking at a form of qualitative research, ethnography. And when we talk about ethnography, it's a naturalistic method based on studying people in their own environments in order to understand the meanings they attribute to their activities. What does that mean? When we engage in ethnography, it's this idea that we're essentially operating in a covert manner. The individuals typically in ethnographic studies do not know that they're being studied because there's something called reactivity. And reactivity is essentially when people know that they're being observed, they're going to change their behaviors. In ethnography, as we adopt this naturalistic approach, we begin to engage in what we call field work. And field work's essentially research that takes place naturally in a social environment, right? Where we begin to engage and observe on a first-hand basis the day-to-day lives of individuals. And what we do in ethnography is that we engage in what we call participant observations. We're not an outsider looking in per se. Instead, we find a way to infiltrate that group, to become a member of that group. We engage in the exact same daily activities as that group. We have to develop trust in order to be welcomed into that group. And we do everything that they do so that we can be viewed as one of their own. Now, ethnography requires a tremendous amount of discipline. You have to suspend your own personal biases and engage with the sociological perspective. You have to be willing to fully commit yourself to ethnographic studies. You can't just say, hey, you know what? I'm only going to do this for a week and that's going to provide me with enough information. That doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. Ethnography requires a tremendous amount of commitment as far as your ability and willingness to participate, as well as the amount of time that you're willing to sacrifice to gain very rich and detailed data research. So as I mentioned before, the participant must join the group that they're studying, right? They need to be able to fully understand why individuals are engaging in the behaviors that they're engaging in. Why do they have this particular belief system? Why do they have this form of social structure within their group? And how does that social structure benefit different groups of individuals? When we talk about ethnography, you have to take field notes. And what we mean by field notes is literally, you're taking notes of your observations. You're taking mental notes. You have a little notebook with you that you're jotting down all these different things that you're observing. Maybe in a more modern society, you may have your cell phone or a tablet or a laptop. And everything that you're seeing, you're typing away. Now, once again, as I mentioned before, this is not overt research. Typically, the people do not know that they're being studied. As I mentioned, it's covert research. So you have to be very sneaky in the way that you approach taking your field notes, because ultimately the collection of all these field notes will lead to a written report of the study, right? You're sharing the narrative of what you witnessed. So one of the first steps, one of the key challenges associated with ethnography or participant observation research is, how do I gain entry? How do I gain access to the field site, to this group of individuals? As we know, certain groups, certain settings may be less difficult to approach as opposed to other settings where outsiders are met with hesitation and distrust. So you have to figure out what it is that's going to gain entry into this group. And there's no magic pill, right? There's no universal approach to gaining entry into a particular group. It's contingent on the situation at hand. We have to develop this good rapport, right? Developing a good rapport allows for trust and acceptance to increase, right? It influences our degree of involvement. It influences how close we can get to the individuals that we are studying. Now, these field notes, as I mentioned before, document the day-to-day activities that are taking place. Very, very detailed in nature, right? And you want to make sure that your field notes are complete. You can't go into the writing phase of providing this narrative saying, you know what, I think this is what happened. No, no, no. Your mind will play tricks on you. Your mind will start to fill in the gaps. And those gaps that are being filled may be filled with things that you didn't necessarily observe. To maintain the integrity of your research, what you absolutely need to do is to make sure that your field notes reflect exactly what you are witnessing. At times, some research in ethnography or in ethnographic studies will use video or photos. I recommend against that because you have to be able to maintain the confidentiality of the people that you're observing, of the people that you're studying. If I go into a situation where, let's say, I'm exploring something related to drug culture, right? And I start filming drug transactions, and I start filming people shooting up with heroin or whatever it may be, yes, that's going to provide a tremendous amount of information for me. I can go back and watch those videos. I can go back and look at those photos. But what if those photos or those videos get into the hands of law enforcement? Yes, the individuals, we can argue, are not engaged in appropriate behaviors, but that's not for us to make that decisions as to whether or not someone's guilty or not. So you always want to maintain confidentiality. So in any type of ethnographic study, I would highly suggest staying away from photos, staying away from videos. At times in ethnography, we have what we call autoethnography. And autoethnography is essentially, rather than focusing on the daily activities of the groups that we're studying, we submerge ourselves into their culture. We submerge ourselves into their day-to-day activities. But we write about our experiences. We provide very detailed notes and accounts of our thoughts, of our feelings, right? Of our experiences in that particular field of study. I personally have done ethnographic studies. I've never done an autoethnographic study because I think on a personal level that ethnography is far more interesting understanding and observing the day-to-day activities of groups that we seek to expand our knowledge of, rather than how I felt in that situation. Because at the end of the day, I'll still be an outsider. Even if I gain acceptance into that group, I'm not living their life 24/7 for my entire life, right? I'm doing it for a short period of time of 3 months, 8 months, a year. And so you want to take that into consideration. When we talk about participant observations, what we want to make sure is that even when we're taking our field notes, obviously we're not going to have time to write a novel when we're doing ethnographic studies. So it's just about jotting down basic notes, key terms that can remind us of the situations. We could write that on napkins. We can write that through text messages to ourselves, whatever works best for you. But the goal is, let's get this thick description, this very detailed description. Now, one of the downsides of ethnography, one of the challenges we can argue, is that I mentioned reactivity before. Well, taking into consideration how your own social status, your gender, your race and ethnicity, your social class, how that can begin to shape how people respond to you, right? What type of access you can gain. Because even though you're seeking to blend in, your status that you hold can certainly have an effect on the research that's being gathered. And so we'll talk about that later on through this class when we start talking about different forms of research that have taken place, about the impact of your social status on the type of ethnographic research you can conduct. In addition to looking at the impact of our social status affecting our interactions and our relationships with members of the group, what we also want to make sure we avoid doing is allowing our personal feelings to get involved, right? Making sure that we show respect to groups, but we don't start to ignore their behaviors. What happens at times is that when we're engaged in ethnography, especially for long periods of time, let's say for a year, we begin to identify with that group to a certain extent, and then we may begin to overlook certain behaviors that we would have originally written down in our field notes, right? We may see individuals engaged, for example, in drug usage. And initially, when we started research, we were writing down everything that we witnessed, and now it's become the norm. Well, if you begin to ignore these realities, you are not going to have detailed field notes. In addition, you have to be able to maintain your personal feelings. You can't engage in ethnographic studies and express your boredom, right? Your contempt for a group of individuals. You have to be able to suspend whatever biases or feelings you may be holding. Now, based on our field notes, we do these very detailed written descriptions of everything that we've seen, and we start to turn it into a narrative, and we start to find different patterns, different themes that may exist. We're trying to fit the data that we're collecting into particular categories. And within these categories, it allows us to develop theories, what we call grounded theory, which is essentially an inductive method of generating theory from data by creating categories in which to place data and then looking for relationships among categories. What does that mean? We're looking for similarities in the data that we're finding. We're looking to establish these key categories so that we can begin to understand the behaviors of what we have witnessed on a first-hand basis, and allowing these experiences, allowing these categories, allowing this data to then influence the creation of theory. See, in most scientific research, you go with a theory first or a hypothesis first, and then you test out whatever you're trying to assess. In qualitative research, in particular ethnographic research, we allow the situation, the experience, to create the theory for us. Now, what are some of the advantages to ethnography? Well, very detailed stories that can provide for a truly enriching and understanding experience of social life. We can challenge taken for granted notions about groups that we didn't have much information about. We can begin to reshape social policy. We can begin to shape and challenge stereotypes that may exist. And ethnography provides us with this very, very unique perspective. It provides us with access to a world that we may have never had access to. Now, some of the disadvantages, though, with ethnography is that it can't be replicated because you cannot repeat the exact same study. You and I are going to have different experiences with access. We're going to have different experiences with groups. We're not going to have access to the exact same people every single time. The environmental conditions or the different situations that exist are not going to be identical. So it's nearly impossible to replicate. Therefore, what happens at this point is that it starts to jeopardize the validity of the study because it can't be replicated. Right? How can we truly measure the effectiveness of this research if I can't conduct the exact same study that you have conducted? Another major disadvantage about ethnography is that is it really a representation of a group as a whole? Or instead, is it actually a representation of the small group of individuals that you observed, right? The small group of individuals that you interacted with. And so you want to keep that in mind as we go through this, right? Some of the challenges that are associated with ethnography revolve around the fact that it's not necessarily applicable to larger groups of individuals. And so I want to take all this into consideration when we're conducting ethnographic research. This idea that we have to be able to make sure that if we're going to publish it, that we can actually apply this to large groups of individuals, that we could suspend our own prejudices, right? We could suspend our own personal biases. And I mentioned this multiple times about the suspension of prejudices, about the suspension of personal biases, for one simple fact. If you want to conduct quality research, that is one of the foundational components of conducting quality research, your ability to suspend your biases and allow the data, regardless of whether or not it's collected through quantitative or qualitative means, to speak for itself. Now let's talk about interviews. And all of us at some point, I assume, have participated in some form of interview. Most likely, those interviews were for a job or for admission into a program or for a scholarship or something of that sort. Interviews provide us a unique opportunity to gather a tremendous amount of information, once again, if the questions are right, if we're asking the questions that will provide detailed responses from our participants. When we talk about interviews, I want us to think about interviews from the perspective of identifying a target population. Who is it that we're seeking to study? Who do we want to collect data from? And so you start to think about your target population. And let me give you an example. So in the field of education, let's say my target population would be students who are non-traditional, meaning above the age of 25, who are first-generation students, who qualify for the Pell Grant, the PELL, the grant that you receive through FAFSA, who are going to school on a full-time basis, and who are working at minimum part-time. That's my target population. So I go to the admissions and records department at Rio Hondo Raleigh Harbor College, and I ask them, can you please pull data for students who are above the age of 25, who are going to school on a full-time basis, who are first-generation students, and who are receiving financial aid. And so let's say out of the, I'm just going to make up a number here, Out of 5,000 students enrolled at Alley Harbor and or Rio Hondo College, they come back and they give me a list of 1,500 students. Now, of those 1,500 students, right, I need to now figure out which of those students at least work part-time. And so what I do for Administrators of Records is that they give me everyone's email address. I send out a blast email. And in this blast email, I say, hey, my name is Dr. Pimentel. I'm a sociology professor. I'm conducting a study on students who are above the age of 25, who are working part-time, who receive the Pell Grant, who are first generation, who are going to school on a full-time basis. Would you be willing to answer this question? Yes or no? The students say yes. Great. I'm going to send a follow-up email asking how many hours do you work a week? And I established that students who are working less than 32 hours a week will qualify as part-time. So I plug in that information, and let's say out of the respondents and all the data I collect, now that cuts down my number to 1,000 students. Okay, that's my target population. But realistically, if I'm conducting interviews, it'd be nearly impossible to conduct interviews with 1,000 students. It's too time consuming. It's too expensive. Everyone has conflicting schedules. So that's going to create an issue for me. So what I then say is, you know what? I'm going to develop a sample population. And sample population is still a representation to a certain degree of my target population. It's just easier to manage. So what I decide is that, you know what? I have enough resources. I have a large enough team where I can essentially conduct 100 interviews. And so what I do is I get all of the names of the 1,000 people who have agreed to participate in my study. And I randomize all those names on an Excel spreadsheet. And I say, for every 10 names, I'm going to invite that individual to participate in my study. So number 10 on the Excel spreadsheet, number 20, all the way till I reach 1,000. That will provide me with 100 names of potential participants. That is my sample size that I will study. And then after I conduct my interviews with them and I disseminate my findings and I write my narrative, that will hopefully allow me to make generalizations about the larger target population. So I conduct these interviews on a one-on-one basis, right? I find that, okay, great. These interviews are working well. I'm collecting a lot of detailed information, but I want more. So what I decide to do is I say to myself, okay, I'm going to invite those 100 individuals that agreed to participate in my study, not only to participate in an interview, but also to participate in what we call focus groups. And focus groups are essentially interviewing a group of individuals together. So I invite, let's say, 5 people per focus group. So I have 20 focus groups in total, myself and my fellow researchers, right? We gather this group, we propose these questions, we introduce these questions, we sit back, we observe the discussion, we ask everyone, hey, is it okay if I audio record? Hey, is it okay if I videotape this discussion? Let's assume everyone provides permission. And the whole time that they're responding to the questions, they're engaged in these very lively discussions with one another. I'm right there writing down details. Right? I'm going to be able to refer back to my audio. I'm going to be able to refer back to my video later on to make sure I didn't miss anything. Right? But anytime we conduct an interview, anytime we conduct a focus group, we have to make sure that all the participants know exactly what they're getting into, that they explicitly agreed to participate, that they provided us with their permission to be audio or video recorded. You cannot, as a researcher, invite people to join your study under a false premise. You can't say, hey, I'm going to ask you questions about your educational experience, and then when everyone shows up, okay, now let's talk about your sexual history. That's misleading. That's unfair to individuals. So what we do is we get informed consents. It's typically a document that's released by different institutions where it provides the purpose of the study. It provides the risk factors associated with being in the study. It provides a promise to keep the information confidential. It gives a breakdown as to how this information will be safeguarded and how people's identities will be protected. It provides an opportunity for the participant to say, you know what, I really don't want to participate in the study anymore. I like to withdraw from the study. And so you want to keep all of that in mind anytime you're conducting research, that you need that informed consent, that it's helpful to have a focus group and also to have interviews take place. Now, when we conduct interviews, what type of questions do we ask? Well, we don't want to ask questions that we could have easily asked on a survey. We're not going to ask individuals in an interview, do you identify as male or female? Do you identify as heterosexual or homosexual? Do you identify, or which of the following groups do you identify as? Latino, Hispanic, African American, Asian, so on and so forth. Because that's a waste of the interviewee's time. And so what we need to do in these situations is we need to make sure that if we're going to ask these close-ended questions, that we ask those questions on a pre-interview survey. Because what we want to focus our time doing is composing good questions that are open-ended, right? That allow the individual to speak freely. So I might ask a question, what do you think about interracial couples? See, it's not as simple as a yes or no question. I want to understand your mindset. I want to understand your belief system in relation to interracial couples, dating or married. It gives you that opportunity to respond openly. And once again, because I'm maintaining your confidentiality, hopefully you will speak freely and honestly. You want to avoid leading questions. And leading questions can be in relation to interracial couples. So when did you have an issue with interracial couples or interracial dating? Well, A, the person never said that they had an issue with interracial dating. And B, you're leading the individual down a path that you want them to go down. Highly unethical. You're depriving them of their freedom and the opportunity to respond freely and honestly. Now, we also want to avoid what we call overly complex questions or double-barreled questions. That's essentially when we ask a question that addresses multiple issues at once. So if I was to ask you a question such as, what has been your learning experience at Rio Hondo or LA Harbor? And how have your interactions been with your counselors? Before you can answer question number one, I'm already bombarding you with question number two. So I'm not going to receive a complete response to either one of my questions. So you want to take that into consideration. You want to avoid double-barreled questions. You want to avoid closed-ended questions when it comes to interviews. At times, we may ask individuals to think about their lives, right? To develop this chronological account of their life experiences, of their life story. That can work at times if you frame the questions appropriately. Right? If you ask individuals, when was the first time that you knew that you struggled in mathematics? What led to those negative experiences with mathematics? At what point in your educational experience did you find out that you were a strong student in English or whatever it may be? That's providing this chronological account, or asking an individual to identify at what point did they gain this familiarity with their sexual orientation? At what point did they know that they were not heterosexual? At what point did the individual know that their gender identity was not consistent, right, with their genitalia in relation to being transgender? Well, these are all factors that we're going to want to ask in this chronological account, in these questions that lead to this chronological account. And at the conclusion of the interviews, the data, the notes that we've taken are transcribed. And once again, similar to qualitative and quantitative research, we look for patterns and similarities. We look for patterns and differences among all of the participants. Now, what we want to make sure we do is that anytime we ask questions in interviews or in focus groups, the questions have to be consistent. I can't ask participant number one a set of questions and then ask participant number two a different set of questions, and so on and so forth. That's not how it works. The questions have to be identical. Now, what are some of the advantages to interviews? Well, obviously, we allow the respondent to respond in their own words. They're able to provide us, hopefully, with a very revealing and complete account of their thoughts, of their feelings, of their beliefs, right? It allows us, once again, to address topics that may be overlooked in research. It allows us to dig deep, and hopefully our participants are willing to provide that information. What are some of the disadvantages? Well, people may not be truthful. They may not be forthcoming. You have to take into account the impact of the interviewer's gender, right? Race or ethnicity in these cases. Right? Will individuals feel more comfortable answering questions that are very personal in nature to someone of the same gender? Right? What if I'm or someone of the same race or ethnicity? What if I'm asking an individual as a Mexican American, do you hold any prejudices, any stereotypes, or any biases against Latino Hispanics? The individual might look at me and say, of course I don't. Yet I know, based on their response to a pre-survey, that they do hold prejudices, but they're afraid to tell me face to face. One of the other issues that we have is, are interviews truly a representation of larger groups? Considering that they only focus on a small group of individuals, can we really generalize these findings? It depends on the type of questions we ask. It depends on how many individuals we're actually interviewing and whether or not that information is generalizable. Now let's cross over to surveys, to quantitative research. And surveys, as we mentioned before, are research-based questionnaires that are administered to a sample of respondents selected from a target population. Once again, we would love to interview every single person every single student at Alley Harbor or Rio Hondo College for our study, but we're only focusing on students who are non-traditional, students who are enrolled on a full-time basis, students who are first generation, students who are receiving the Pell Grant, and students who are working at least part-time. So that's where the sample population, that's where our target population comes into play. Because surveys can be shared with larger groups of individuals to the point where I no longer have to only survey 100 individuals, my sample population, I could reach out to actually 1,000 students that fulfill those requirements that I've established as far as who I want to study, right? It allows me to engage my research on a more macro level, right? Because I can send out these surveys to students via email. I can hand out paper surveys. I create these surveys and distribute them on Instagram or on Facebook or on Twitter, right? And I can collect I can collect this information relatively quickly, relatively easily, and most surveys have yes or no responses, right? Most surveys will have Likert scales, as we mentioned before, strongly agree to strongly disagree. So I distribute these surveys. Occasionally I'll have open-ended questions where there's a free write, but for the most part, the surveys are going to be closed-ended questions. I'm going to give the participants a handful of responses that they can choose. One that best reflects their opinions, their thoughts. When we create survey questions, we want to make sure that we're not using big words, that we're not creating any type of confusion. We want to think about avoiding leading questions. We want to avoid placing our participants in any situation that will confuse them, because what happens in surveys, as well as interviews, is that if people are confused, they oftentimes become turned off from participating in further research. And so that can create quite an obstacle when we're conducting research, because you may have 20 interview questions and the person says, you know what, I'm so confused, I can't continue with this interview. And you just lost one participant. Now, if you lose one participant, that's not a big deal. But what happens if that leads to 15 to 20 participants leaving your study? That is a big deal. We want to avoid bias in any of the questions that we're asking as well. Now, when we talk about surveys and sampling, trying to find out, okay, who exactly is going to participate in my study? What we have to take into consideration is this idea of what we call a simple random sample. And a simple random sample is essentially what I discussed before when I was discussing how we would select 100 participants out of 1,000 in an interview. It's this idea that everyone has an equal chance to participate, that I'm not going to go down in alphabetical order and choose every 10 individuals, that I'm going to randomize all the names, and every 10th or every 20th person, right, has an opportunity to participate in the study. That's a simple random sample. They're part of my target population, right? They meet all the requirements that I've established, but at the same time, everyone has an equal opportunity to participate. Now, a representative sample is essentially, can I generalize these findings? Can I generalize my data to a larger population? But I need to take into consideration social class, race and ethnicity, gender and age. I can't conduct a study on the experiences of African American students at Rio Hondo College or Los Angeles Harbor College and only have 10% of my participants identifying as African American. That will not provide me with accurate data. So if I'm looking at student populations and I know that 45% of my population's Latino Hispanic, I know that 70% of my population is between the ages of 18 to 21. Well, I need to make sure that I have a similar percentage of my participants who meet those requirements or who are representations of the school's population. Now, in order to have a study of any kinds deemed valid, we have to focus on the response rate. And the response rate is essentially the number or the percentage of surveys that are completed by the respondents and returned to the researcher. Ideally, we would love 100% of the people to respond, but that's not realistic in most cases. We can conduct research and consider it valid typically when we have a large enough population and we have 20 to 30% of the individuals that we've invited actually participate in the study. Now, if I have 1,000 people and 20, 30%, meaning 200, 300 participate, not the ideal situation, but I can run with that data. If I have 10 individuals that I've invited and only 2 or 3 respond, I can't generalize. I can't run with that data. I would have to find some new way to recruit individuals. I would have to expand my target population or expand my sample population. We collect all these surveys, and once again, it's form of quantitative, so we're measuring responses. So for all the yeses, I might say that those have a 1 value. For all the no's, those have a 2 value. The 1 or 2 value is insignificant, right? I could say one's 10, I could say one's 5. But I'm looking at the frequency and responses. How many people said yes? How many people said no? I break that down in percentage form, right? By tabulating all that data, by analyzing that data, right? I can code it if I want to. I can turn it into numerical figures if that's easier to share with individuals, which I would argue is typically yes, a lot easier to share, right? And I can start to develop conclusions. I can start to affect the culture or the policies of a particular institution based on this data that I've collected. So what are some of the advantages to surveys? Well, as I mentioned before, not very time consuming, easy to send out to the masses, and not very expensive to create and to use. We typically can generalize the findings because surveys usually relate to a larger population. Right? Because we can conduct the same study multiple times, right, using the exact same questions, right, the data is fairly reliable. We hope so, at least, that people are being honest. We can argue that there's a degree of validity there because this is a study that can be replicated. Right? We can begin to limit observer bias or respondent bias or interview bias because, as Jay-Z says, men lie, women lie, numbers don't. And we're allowing the numbers to speak for themselves. Right? We're hoping that individuals will be truly honest, considering that we typically don't ask them to write their names on a survey, so they're anonymous. Now, what are some of the disadvantages? Well, once again, we don't have this detailed opportunity to gain as much information as we possibly can from respondents because people are very limited in the responses they can provide. And I'm sorry for the background noise. I'm actually in my son's room right now, and his Zelda toy just went off for some reason. In addition to that, we have to take into consideration, just the same way we'd have to take into consideration when we're conducting interviews. People are self-reporting. Are they truly being honest? Or are they responding the way they think we want them to respond? Are they self-filtering their responses out of fear of somehow you're going to figure out how they bubbled in a particular response and you're going to practice prejudice against them? What we want to also take into consideration is that people self-select, right? And what we mean by that is they self-select to participate. So you're getting people who are motivated to participate in a study, in a survey, rather than a general population where maybe individuals don't really want to participate in the study. So they're not going to volunteer. I want us to take all that into consideration as we think about surveys. And then let's look at existing sources. Existing sources are essentially data that's already been produced, historical records that are already in existence, marriage license, building permits, books, magazines, television shows, websites. They've been produced for some other reason, but now we're pulling that to pull data for social research. Existing sources are considered unobtrusive measures because we don't have to affect a person's life. We don't have to go and interact with an individual and say, can you participate in this interview, this focus group, or this survey? Right? We don't disturb anyone. We're looking at things that are already in existence. So if we're watching a television show and understanding or seeking to analyze the portrayal of particular ethnic or racial minority groups, if we're looking at data that's already been collected by a series of researchers, that's a form of existing sources. That's a form of secondary research. We can look at what we call comparative historical research. And this seeks to understand relationships between the elements of societies in different regions at different time periods. It allows us to begin to analyze cultural artifacts, such as literature, paintings, newspapers, photographs, right? And start to develop conclusions about what all these different forms of research, all these different forms of documents or records tell us. We can provide content analysis, right? We look for themes, we look for variables, we look and establish categories that may appear in text or image or in the message of the media. The advantages are, well, as I mentioned before, it's unobtrusive. Right? At times, it's impossible to gather information about things that happened 150 years ago or things that happened 50 years ago. So existing sources provide us that window of opportunity. We can use the US Census Bureau, for example, to gain information about family size, about educational attainment, about occupational status, about residential patterns, data that would be nearly impossible for all of us to gather because it would be too time consuming and it would be way too expensive. Right? We can use political speeches, we can use newspapers, right, to begin to understand what was the mindset, what was the culture at that particular time? What type of language was used at that particular time? And in many ways, right, it provides us with a foundation to establish reliability. It provides us with a historical foundation for why we're conducting our studies. Now, what are some of the disadvantages? Well, if we're looking at existing research, for example, did the researcher provide the right questions on surveys and in interviews? Right? Did they provide a complete picture? Did they gather enough information to create that complete picture? Right? Another disadvantage is, well, was that person practicing any type of bias in how they interpreted that information? Right? They're running a newspaper article. Is this newspaper article biased? Well, we don't know because we don't have all of the data that that individual collected in order to inform their article. And so I want you to take that into consideration. We're not going to talk about experimental methods right now. That's something that we'll talk about later on. So let me skip these particular slides. Experimental methods are essentially what you do in your science classes, where you have the independent and dependent variables, right? Where you develop this hypothesis and you see if you can actually address that hypothesis, right? If you can prove it correct or if you can prove it incorrect or wrong. When we talk about values, objectivity, and reactivity, let's talk about value-free sociology. And once again, right, not allowing our personal beliefs or biases to interfere with our research, right? Now, we have basic research, which is essentially the acquisition of knowledge without an agenda or particular goal in mind. You might be watching a movie and saying, hey, you know what? I recognize that actor or actress. Let me Google their name. And then you start looking at all the other movies that they've come out and you're like, oh, I remember that person coming out in that movie. I was watching not too long ago, Black Hawk Down. And as I'm watching Black Hawk Down, it's a war film from the U.S. intervention in Somalia. Great, great film. I noticed all these actors that I had never realized in all my times of watching that particular film. I noticed, oh my gosh, that's such and such. Oh man, that's such and such, right? That's basic research. Applied research is when we gather knowledge that can be used to create social change, right? That can begin to change the culture of organizations. And that's exactly what we do when we conduct interviews, when we conduct surveys, when we conduct focus groups or ethnographic studies. We look at objectivity, right? A degree of impartiality. The ability to allow for the facts to speak for themselves without us allowing our own personal feelings to infiltrate the interpretation of the data. And then earlier I mentioned reactivity. The tendency of people and events to react to the process of being studied. So let me give you an example of the Hawthorne effect. It's one of the major forms, or major examples, I should say, of reactivity. So from 1927 to 1932, a Harvard professor studied the motivation and productivity of workers at the Hawthorne plant of Western Electric in Chicago. Productivity increased with changes to lighting levels, rest breaks, and increases to the pay. But when the changes were reversed, the productivity continued to increase. So what the researcher decided to do is say, okay, why is it that when I changed the lighting, when I changed compensation levels, when I gave rest breaks, people became more productive, but then even when I took it away, people were still highly productive. Why is that happening? Well, the researcher concluded that the increased productivity had nothing to do with changing the lights, had nothing to do with changing compensation or providing rest breaks, but it had everything to do with people knowing that they were being observed, that they were being studied. Think about at your own workplace. Right? At times, we may slack off. Right? I worked in department stores before, and it's a slow time. Right? You're walking around the department. You touch up a few things here and there, but for the most part, you might be talking to your coworkers, just chilling. Then your boss or a regional manager comes around, and all of a sudden, you become the best employee in the world. Right? You're right there going to the TVs, cleaning each TV. You're stacking the boxes nicely, right? You're right there organizing the cell phones, whatever it may be. Well, that's reactivity, right? You know that you're being observed, so you're going to respond in a way that makes you appear to be favorable. Then we talk about research ethics, and we talk about deception. When people are unaware of the project or unaware of the goals or unaware of the fact that they're being studied, well, that's one of the major issues with ethnography, is that it is a form of deception. And now that you have to go through the IRB process, which is the Institutional Review Board, and they ask you questions as to, well, how is this going to affect participants? How are you going to maintain confidentiality? Right? There's a strong possibility that conducting ethnographic studies may be viewed as unethical. Right? May not necessarily be granted the permit. You may not necessarily be granted the permission to conduct your study. As we mentioned before, confidentiality, protecting the person's identity, and then following a code of ethics, right? Where you're not placing individuals in dangerous situations. You're not setting up scenarios like reality TV shows do, just to see how people respond to one another. So I want you to take all this into consideration as you're answering the discussion to post or question, I should say. Let me stop recording, and then what we'll do is I'll answer any questions that you may have.